January 17, 1943. Morning fog clings to the frozen runway at Regensburg, Bavaria. The cold bites through leather jackets and wool-lined boots. Oberleutnant Franz Stigler stands beside his Messerschmitt Bf 109 G6, breath visible in the winter air, watching mechanics adjust the propeller pitch. The smell of aviation fuel mixes with engine oil, a scent that has become as familiar as the leather of his gloves. Somewhere beyond the grey curtain of clouds, Allied bombers are crossing the English Channel. The scramble order will come soon. It always does. But on this morning, Stigler and his fellow pilots share cigarettes and weak coffee, trading stories about a new American fighter they've been hearing about through intelligence reports and intercepted radio chatter. A strange aircraft with 2 engines, 2 tails, and a performance envelope that sounds too good to be true. The Luftwaffe pilots laugh. They call it der Gabelschwanz Teufel, in mockery, the fork-tailed devil, though not yet with the fear that name will later carry. To them, it seems absurd. An aircraft trying to be everything, a fighter, an interceptor, a long-range escort. In their experience, such compromises always fail. The twin-boom configuration looks ungainly, almost fragile. How could such a machine compete with the sleek, proven designs of the Reich? How could American engineering, rushed and mass-produced, stand against years of Teutonic precision? The laughter in that frozen morning would not last the year. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning emerged from a design philosophy that the Luftwaffe fundamentally misunderstood, that war in the air was changing, and that the future belonged not to the most elegant fighter, but to the one that could adapt to the brutal realities of strategic bombing campaigns across an entire continent. When Clarence Kelly Johnson and Hall Hibbard conceived the P-38 inches, 1937, they were responding to a U.S. Army Air Corps specification that seemed nearly impossible, an interceptor capable of reaching 360 miles per hour at altitude with a climb rate of 20,000 feet in 6 minutes. The conventional single-engine designs of the era couldn't achieve such performance without an engine that didn't yet exist. They mounted 2 Allison Von 710 engines on twin booms, connected by a central nacelle housing the pilot and armament. The design was radical, unorthodox, and to European eyes trained on the flowing lines of Spitfires and Messerschmitts, it looked wrong. But aerodynamics doesn't care about aesthetics. The P-38's twin-engine configuration provided redundancy, power, and most critically, the ability to mount heavy armament in the nose without the vibration and synchronization issues of wing-mounted or engine-mounted guns. 4. 50-caliber machine guns and 120mm cannon could fire directly along the aircraft's center line, creating a cone of fire that didn't converge at a single point but remained effective from 100 to 1,000 yards. This was the kind of engineering that prioritized function over form, results over reputation. German intelligence files on the P-38 began accumulating in late 1941 when the first production models entered service with the USAAF. Luftwaffe analysts studied reconnaissance photographs and pilot reports with a mixture of curiosity and disdain. The aircraft's unorthodox appearance reinforced existing prejudices about American engineering, that it was brute force rather than finesse, quantity over quality. The twin-tail design seemed to violate every principle of streamlined fighter design that had emerged from the air battles over Spain, Poland, and France. Major Günther Rahl, who would become one of the Luftwaffe's highest-scoring aces, later recalled the initial briefings. "We were told this was a heavy fighter, useful perhaps for reconnaissance or ground attack, but not a serious threat in air-to-air combat. The belief was that our Bf 109 seconds and 4 190 seconds, lighter and more maneuverable, would simply turn inside them and shoot them down. This assessment was based on a fundamental assumption about aerial combat that the P-38 would systematically dismantle, that dogfighting agility at low altitude was the primary measure of fighter effectiveness. The German pilots expected to face an aircraft that would be clumsy, slow to respond, perhaps dangerous in a straight line, but vulnerable in a turning fight. What they couldn't anticipate from intelligence photographs and technical specifications was how the P-38's unique characteristics would create an entirely new tactical paradigm. They didn't understand that Lockheed had built a fighter for a different kind of war than the one the Luftwaffe had been training for. While German pilots honed their skills in tight, energy-bleeding turns and close-quarters maneuvering, the P-38 was designed for the vast distances of the Pacific and the high-altitude bomber escort missions over Europe. It was built for a war of endurance, altitude, and overwhelming firepower. The twin-turbocharged Allison engines gave it performance that actually increased with altitude, a characteristic almost unique among fighters of 1943. While Bf 109 seconds and FUDBO 190s suffered power loss above 25,000 feet, the P-38's turbochargers maintained manifold pressure, allowing it to cruise comfortably at 30,000 feet and climb effectively to 40,000. This wasn't just a technical advantage, it was a fundamental shift in the geometry of air combat. The first systematic encounters between P-38 seconds and frontline Luftwaffe fighters began in November 1942, when the 1st and 14th Fighter Groups deployed to North Africa as part of Operation Torch. The early combat reports revealed something that surprised both sides. The P-38 wasn't invincible, but it also wasn't the easy target German pilots had anticipated. On November 19, 1942, elements of the 27th Fighter Squadron encountered Bf 109s over Tunisia. Second Lieutenant Elza Shahan, flying P-38F1, engaged 3 Messerschmitts at 18,000 feet. His after-action report described the encounter with clinical precision. Enemy aircraft attempted to engage in turning combat, maintained speed and altitude advantage. When Mi-109 pulled into the vertical climb, I followed with full throttle. At approximately 22,000 feet, enemy aircraft stalled. I continued climbing to 24,000 feet, rolled inverted, and engaged from above. Enemy aircraft were destroyed with concentrated fire from all weapons. The report was remarkable, not for the kill-air combat produced thousands of such encounters, but for what it revealed about the tactical reality of fighting the P-38. The German pilot had fought the way he'd been trained, pulling into a climbing turn that would have forced most Allied fighters to break off or stall. But the P-38 simply climbed through his maneuver, negating years of tactical doctrine in 30 seconds of vertical flight. This pattern repeated itself across North Africa throughout the winter of 1942-43. Luftwaffe pilots who engaged P-38 seconds in traditional dogfighting maneuvers often found themselves at a disadvantage, not because the Lightning could outturn them, it generally couldn't, but because it didn't need to. The P-38's speed and climb rate allowed its pilots to dictate the terms of engagement. They could choose when to fight and when to disengage. More critically, they could maintain the energy advantage that was becoming the central principle of modern air combat. German tactical manuals had emphasized turning performance and instantaneous maneuverability, concepts born from the close-range, low-altitude combat of earlier years. But at 25,000 feet over the Mediterranean, those doctrines meant less than engine power, compressibility limits, and the ability to convert altitude into speed and speed into altitude. The P-38 excelled at this energy management in ways that confused and frustrated German pilots trained in different tactical traditions. The psychological impact of these encounters began to accumulate through early 1943. Luftwaffe pilots who had dominated the skies over France in 1940 and Russia in 1941 now faced an opponent that seemed to operate by different rules. Oberfeldwebel Heinz Nocker, flying Bf 109G 6 seconds with JG-1, recorded his impressions after an engagement near Bizerte in February 1943. The American pilot refused to dogfight. Each time we maneuvered into position, he climbed away. We followed, but at 7,000 meters our engines began to lose power. The American continued climbing. We could only watch as he disappeared into the sun. This wasn't cowardice on the American pilot's part, it was sound tactical doctrine, exploiting a technical advantage, but to pilots raised on notions of chivalric air combat and aggressive engagement, it felt like fighting an opponent who wouldn't stand and face them properly. This frustration was compounded by the growing realization that the P-38's armament made even brief exposure to its guns potentially fatal. The concentrated nose-mounted weapons produced a stream of fire that didn't require the deflection shooting necessary with wing-mounted guns. A 2-second burst from a P-38 could deliver approximately 150 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition and 20mm shells into a target area smaller than a fighter's fuselage. German armor and self-sealing fuel tanks offered some protection against machine gun fire, but the 20mm cannon shells were devastating. By spring 1943, the P-38 was appearing in increasing numbers over Europe itself. The 55th and 20th Fighter Groups began flying bomber escort missions from England, and the 82nd Fighter Group operated from North Africa. These operations revealed the aircraft's true strategic value. It could escort heavy bombers deep into German-held territory, fight off interceptors, and return home with fuel to spare. The range that had seemed excessive in peacetime specifications now became the critical factor in the bomber war. A P-38 with external drop tanks could fly round-trip missions of 1,300 miles, roughly the distance from London to Berlin and back. No Luftwaffe fighter could match this endurance while maintaining combat capability. The Bf 109, superlative in many ways, had an operational radius of barely 400 miles with drop tanks. This meant that German fighters defending the Reich were tied to a defensive perimeter, while P-38 seconds could range freely across the entire combat zone, choosing their battles and protecting the bomber streams that were systematically destroying German industrial capacity. The twin-boom configuration that had seemed so awkward on the ground proved to have unexpected advantages in combat. The cockpit, mounted in the central nacelle between the engines, provided excellent visibility in all directions, a critical advantage when survival depended on seeing the enemy first. The heavy engines and booms absorbed considerable damage that would have been catastrophic in a single-engine fighter. Pilots returned to base with one engine shot out, with control surfaces damaged, with sections of boom missing. The redundancy built into the design meant that many hits that would have downed a Bf 109 or 4190 left the P-38 still flyable. Lieutenant Colonel J. Robbins of the 8th Fighter Group survived an encounter over Rabaul in October 1943, in which his P-38 took 20mm cannon hits to both engines, lost the left elevator, and suffered hydraulic failure. He flew the crippled aircraft 400 miles back to base on one engine, landed gear up, and walked away. The aircraft was classified as repairable. Such resilience bred confidence among P-38 pilots, and growing respect tinged with fear among their opponents. But the transformation of German perception wasn't complete until the summer of 1943, when P-38 seconds began to dominate the aerial battles over Sicily and Italy. On July 10, 1943, during the invasion of Sicily, the 82nd Fighter Group flew top cover for the landing forces. Major William Leverett engaged a formation of Ju-87 Stukas with Bf 109 escorts over Gela. In a single mission lasting 45 minutes, Leverett shot down 7 enemy aircraft, 6 Bf 109s, and 1 Ju-87. His gun camera footage, reviewed later by intelligence officers, showed the devastating effectiveness of the P-38's concentrated firepower. Each engagement lasted seconds. A brief tracking period, a 2- or 3-second burst, and the target aircraft disintegrated or exploded. There was no prolonged maneuvering, no extended dogfight. The P-38's speed allowed Leverett to engage, kill, disengage, and re-engage before the remaining German pilots could coordinate a response. This wasn't the aerial combat of 1940, where fighters circled each other like dueling swordsmen. This was industrial killing, efficient and impersonal. The intelligence summaries flowing into Luftwaffe headquarters through summer 1943 showed a clear pattern. Pilot losses when engaging P-38 seconds were disproportionately high, and more critically, experienced pilots, the irreplaceable veterans, were being lost at an alarming rate. On August 17, 1943, during the disastrous Schweinfurt-Regensburg raids, P-38 seconds of the 55th Fighter Group engaged elements of JG-26 and JG-2 over Belgium. The German pilots, attacking crippled B-17 seconds, found themselves bounced by P-38 seconds, diving from 30,000 feet. The speed of the dive, the P-38, could reach 500 miles per hour in a steep descent, gave the German pilots almost no warning. 4 Bf-109 seconds and 3 FTW-190 seconds were shot down in less than 10 minutes. The P-38 seconds, having exhausted their ammunition, simply climbed back to altitude and returned to base. The German pilots on the ground later reported seeing the twin-tailed silhouettes climbing away almost vertically, an impossible maneuver for their own aircraft at that altitude. It was a demonstration of capability that technical specifications could never fully convey. The symbolic power of the twin-tail silhouette began to haunt German defensive planning. Unlike the Spitfire, which looked aggressive and purposeful, or the Mustang, which was sleek and beautiful, the P-38 looked alien, almost mechanical in its symmetry. Pilots who survived encounters with it described a sense of being hunted by something that didn't follow the expected patterns of air combat. The nickname Gabelschwanz-Teufel, initially coined in mockery, became genuinely ominous. Propaganda photographs that were supposed to show captured P-38 seconds as evidence of German victory instead circulated among Luftwaffe units as reminders of a capable, dangerous opponent. The aircraft's distinctive appearance meant it was always recognizable, always identifiable in combat reports. You couldn't mistake a P-38 for anything else, and by autumn 1943, that distinctive shape represented a fundamental shift in aerial warfare that the Luftwaffe was struggling to counter. German fighter tactics evolved in response. Tactical directives issued in September 1943 instructed pilots to avoid sustained engagements with P-38 seconds at high altitude, to attack only when possessing altitude and speed advantage, and to disengage vertically if the American fighter demonstrated superior climbing performance. These were defensive tactics, acknowledgements that the P-38 now dictated the terms of combat. For a fighter force that had built its doctrine on aggressive engagement and offensive spirit, such instructions represented a profound psychological defeat. Major Gerhard Barkhorn, third highest scoring ace in history, later wrote in his memoirs, "The P-38 forced us to rethink everything we knew about fighter combat. It was fast when it needed to be fast. It climbed better than anything we had above 6,000 meters, and its firepower could destroy any of our aircraft with a single burst. Most dangerous of all, it had the range to be everywhere." You could no longer plan defensive operations, assuming the American fighters would need to turn back. They were always there, and they were almost always above you. The statistical evidence supported these impressions. Between June and December 1943, P-38 units in the Mediterranean and European theatres claimed 1,771 enemy aircraft destroyed against losses of 302 P-38 seconds to all causes. The kill ratio, while subject to the usual overclaiming on both sides, represented a clear tactical advantage. More importantly, the presence of P-38 seconds measurably reduced bomber losses on escorted missions. B-17 and B-24 groups with P-38 escort suffered approximately 40% fewer losses than unescorted formations. This wasn't just about shooting down German fighters, it was about area denial, about creating zones of aerial superiority that German interceptors couldn't penetrate without accepting catastrophic losses. The strategic bombers were destroying Germany's ability to wage war, and the P-38 seconds were enabling that destruction by making the airspace over the Reich too costly for the Luftwaffe to defend effectively. Yet the P-38 wasn't invincible. It had vulnerabilities that skilled German pilots learned to exploit. The early Allison engines were prone to failure in extreme cold, a significant problem in the sub-freezing temperatures at high altitude over northern Europe. The cockpit heating was inadequate, leading to frostbite among pilots on long missions. Most critically, the P-38 suffered from a phenomenon called compressibility in high-speed dives. As the aircraft approached the speed of sound approximately 660 miles per hour at altitude, the airflow over the wings became disrupted, causing loss of control. Several P-38 seconds were lost to this phenomenon before Lockheed engineers developed dive flaps that disrupted the supersonic airflow and restored control. But these were technical problems with technical solutions. They didn't change the fundamental equation. The P-38 had created a new standard for fighter performance that the Luftwaffe couldn't match with existing designs. The German response was to accelerate development of next-generation fighters, the Me-262 jet, the Ta-152 high-altitude interceptor, the He-162 Volksjäger. These programs consumed resources, engineering talent, and time that Germany didn't have. They were tactical responses to a strategic problem that American industry was producing not just good aircraft, but good aircraft in quantities that made pilot training, tactical innovation, and even aerial combat skill secondary to the sheer weight of numbers. By late 1943, Lockheed was producing P-38 at a rate of 400 per month. German factories, despite heroic efforts and the brutal exploitation of slave labor, could barely maintain production of 1,000 fighters of all types per month, while replacing losses, repairing damage, and dispersing factories to avoid bombing. The P-38 wasn't just a better fighter in technical terms, it was the product of an industrial system that the Reich could never match. The psychological transformation was perhaps most evident in the accounts of German pilots who were captured and interrogated. These men, trained to believe in German technical superiority and the decisive importance of pilot skill, found themselves confronting an uncomfortable reality: that they'd been fighting with inferior equipment against opponents who had both numerical and technical advantages. Interrogation reports from late 1943 show a marked shift in attitude. Where earlier prisoners had been confident, almost dismissive of American aviation, now there was grudging respect mixed with confusion. How had America, industrial but supposedly soft and inexperienced, produced such capable weapons and pilots? The answer lay in a system of mass production, standardized training, and technological innovation that Germany's artisanal approach to manufacturing and elite-focused training system couldn't replicate. The P-38 was emblematic of this approach, a complex aircraft produced in large numbers with consistent quality, flown by adequately trained pilots who didn't need to be aces to be effective. The twin tails became a symbol of this industrial and tactical superiority. In the grey skies over Europe, those distinctive booms represented American reach, American power, American willingness to bring the war directly to the Reich's heartland. For German civilians watching contrails high overhead, the P-38 meant that their cities were defenseless, that the Luftwaffe could no longer protect them, that all the promises of invincibility and superior German technology were hollow. For German pilots scrambling to intercept bomber formations, the sight of P-38 at high altitude meant a dangerous mission had become potentially fatal. And for Allied bomber crews, the twin-tailed escorts represented the difference between a 25-mission tour and an early grave over some anonymous German city. By December 1943, the transformation was complete. The aircraft that German pilots had mocked as ungainly and impractical had become the most feared Allied fighter in the European theatre. Intelligence summaries from that month noted that Luftwaffe units were increasingly reluctant to engage when P-38 were present, preferring to wait until the American escorts reached the limit of their range before attacking the bombers. But the P-38's range meant that limit kept extending deeper into Germany. Missions to Berlin, once thought impossible for escorted daylight raids, became routine. The strategic bombing campaign that would ultimately destroy German war production and kill hundreds of thousands of civilians proceeded with the twin-tailed Lightnings circling high above, visible reminders that control of the air had shifted irrevocably. The legacy of this transformation extended beyond tactical success. The P-38 proved that American engineering, despite European skepticism, could innovate and dominate. It proved that unorthodox designs, when based on sound principles and clear operational requirements, could outperform conventional wisdom. And it proved that in modern warfare, the ability to mass-produce sophisticated weapons was as important as designing them. Germany had excellent engineers, brave pilots, and strong tactical traditions. But tradition and skill couldn't overcome an opponent who had more aircraft, more fuel, more pilots, and crucially, more of everything tomorrow than they'd had today. The P-38 was the aerial embodiment of American material superiority, and the twin tails were the banner of that superiority flying over a dying Reich, the fork-tailed devil. The name that began as mockery ended as a grudging compliment, an acknowledgement that the strange-looking aircraft with its twin booms and unconventional layout had rewritten the rules of aerial combat. In frozen German dispersal areas, pilots who'd once laughed at intelligence briefings now gathered around recognition charts, studying the P-38 silhouette, memorizing its lines, preparing for encounters they knew would come and which many wouldn't survive. The transformation was complete. The ungainly forktail had become the symbol of a new kind of warfare, where technical capability and industrial power mattered more than tradition, where altitude and energy trumped turning radius, where the future belonged not to the most elegant design, but to the one that could adapt to the brutal arithmetic of strategic air war. In the cold morning light of January 1943, Franz Stigler had shared cigarettes with his comrades and laughed at the strange American twin-tail. By year's end, that laughter had died in the throats of 1,000 German pilots who'd learned too late that war doesn't care about aesthetics, that mockery is the privilege of the ignorant, and that sometimes the strangest-looking weapon proves to be the most effective. The P-38 Lightning hadn't just outclimbed the Luftwaffe's fighters. It had outthought them, outproduced them, and ultimately outlasted them. The twin tails climbed into history trailing contrails of victory, each white line across the European sky another thread in the shroud of the Third Reich.